Before I start, let me just connect to the previous talk. So I was struck in Paolo's opening discussion. I found myself disagreeing with what Paolo was saying quite strongly. And I think as I go through, you'll see why. What I want to disagree with is this idea that visualizations encourage uncertainty. And he said, and I wrote this down, he said, visualizations displace doubt onto something else. So visual things shift doubt onto something else. And he describes them as instruments of interrogation rather than about constructing reality. So they provoke interrogation rather than shape reality. Now, it will become clear as I go through my slides that the visual thing I'm going to talk about is exactly about getting rid of uncertainty and doubt. And the people who make the visual do it for their clients, but this has a devastating effect on IT markets. So, as I go through, bear this in mind. Okay, so I work in the IT area, and I mean the IT area is a very difficult space to operate in because it changes all the time, and it's not just that there's constant innovations of new technologies. The entire category of technology is constantly changing. There are always new categories of technologies and markets, and if you follow the space, you'll know that. There's several hundred types of market segments over the last kind of decade or two. And some of this happens because of technical innovation, and it's the vendors themselves who are the innovators. But also this innovation, this change of new market categories also comes from some of the intermediaries who operate in this sector. So these are intermediaries whose job is to spot, right, to identify change and new categories, but these players turn out to be just as innovative as the people they're actually watching, the vendors. And if you've been to a retreat before, you know that I'm interested in the firm called Gartner, and Gartner are one of these market intermediaries. And Gartner itself has produced, and I use those words on purpose, produced over 300 different market categories in the last number of years. Facebook at Work is a new technology that Facebook recently launched just last year. In fact, it was on the radio this morning, if you caught that. Facebook at Work is part of a new category that Gartner have produced called social software. So basically social media for the workplace, so social software. So they launched this category about five years ago. When they launch a category, a new market segment, right, they give it a name, social software, but they also launch this here, which is they call the Magic Quadrant. And I've talked about this at other retreats, but so they launched this. This comes with every new segment. And you can see these are all the vendors who are producing different kinds of social software. And so you can you can see Microsoft, IBM, you can see Google in there, Jive Software. But then it starts to get a bit fuzzy. You can't really see it, right? All the names are kind of grouped together. But that turns out to be quite important, right? What they found, or what they continually find in new areas, that there's so many players, and this is Gartner's own slide, there are so many players that they find it difficult to represent it on their Magic Quadrant. So they can't capture all the players on the quadrant. So what do? Okay, they don't try and represent it in some other way, like a list. What they do is they create new market segments, right? So they actually split the market up into further segments. And by doing that, that allows them to get what they call the beautiful picture. So rather than having a very busy, cluttered visualization, what they get is a nice and easy visualization to make sense of. And the beautiful picture is 25 dots, so 25 vendors. So 25 vendors, you can count them. There are more or less 25 on each of these beautiful pictures. Now, what's interesting about this is, okay, so this one has become an actual market. This one has become an actual market. This means that vendors now identify themselves according to how these markets are defined by Gartner. The players they compete against are all the players in the Magic Quadrant for this particular market. So these are two fully functioning markets. They did this work about 5 years ago, so we've been able to kind of trace how they've done this. This one didn't become a market. It failed. It didn't capture anybody's attention, and they retired it straight away. Okay, just to kind of, so you know what I'm saying here. So they can't fit stuff onto their Magic Quadrant, so they create markets instead to make up the limitations, the material limitations of their main graphic illustration, and they create markets to make up for these affordances. So what I want to talk about is how these affordances, both material affordances of this picture, but also other kinds of affordances within the general knowledge system of this organization, this intermediary, how these shape markets. And I'm calling these prosthetic markets. So these intermediaries construct prosthetic markets. They're often future-orientated, so they're looking slightly ahead of what's going on, trying to work out what's going to happen, and they'll try and capture a trend. They're temporary. They're not meant to be permanent. They're unleashed as temporary instruments, and they're different from how we might think of as organic markets, which are a vendor who has a connection to a community of users. They're very different from those kinds of markets. They result from the affordances of the knowledge system of this intermediary. And so what I want to talk about is, why do they create them? For what reason? Who benefits from them? What's their consequences? And particularly, what's the mechanism, the practices, and the dynamics around them? And what kind of things guide them when they're segmenting markets? What are they thinking about? And I'm interested in this idea of the prosthetic. And there's been quite a lot of writing about what a prosthetic is. And I've taken a few definitions. This one comes from the work of Freud, who talked about the idea of a prosthetic god. And what he wanted to capture how prosthetics could make people magnificent, but at the same time they could give them much trouble. So on the one hand, they enable people, but also they constrain them. So I want to kind of capture this double aspect of a prosthetic. And of course, the idea of prosthetic comes from the work of Michel Cologne as well. And he talks about how prosthetics are like props, which help people to act, to decide, to calculate, and to operate in markets. I'm also using the idea from Corey Callistan of the idea of a prosthetic price. So he talked about how prices were calculated within cotton markets, and he talked about the way in which traders would work with more or less invented prices as they moved towards the actual price. So the actual price is based on a kind of invented price. And these invented prices are not contested by any of the actors at play. The term prosthetic market also draws on Martha Lampman's idea of a false or provisional number. Again, numbers which are created, not real numbers, just created, made up out of thin air. And what I'd want to suggest, just to differentiate my work from theirs, to say that they tend to suggest these things are all arbitrary. People invent them. And what I want to show is that they're the result of the affordances of this knowledge system itself. So they result from the particular knowledge system in place. In doing the paper, I've been looking at different kinds of literatures, and there is an interesting literature on what market categories do within markets. And people talk about them as devices that create order in markets, that they standardize, they draw boundaries, they allow classification, commensuration. So if you're inside the boundary of a market, you can be compared and seen as commensurate with other players. People talk about the fact that when you create a market category, that is in itself the work of commensuration. There's also a lot of work on intermediaries, and this work has evolved quite rapidly. So the initial picture was that intermediaries were actors who kind of lubricated exchange. That's kind of moved on. People think of intermediaries actually shaping, constituting exchanges now. And again, the literature tends to say that the main thing that intermediaries do is classify and commensurate. But there's an interesting work idea that they're also kind of political actors in themselves, as well. And there's an interesting paper talking about the fact that when intermediaries work with markets, they tend to side with the large incumbents. So they take the side of the powerful players because they support them and they will work in their benefit. So there's a kind of politics as well connected with the work on intermediaries. Okay, so just a quick note about who Gartner are. They're the largest analyst firm. They weren't the first, but they have very quickly become the dominant player and radically changed how this area works. So the main thing they do is they offer kind of advice to IT buyers. So if you work within a large firm and you've got £5 million to spend on a new IT system, it's likely you will talk to Gartner. And the other thing I should point out is they've shifted this idea that once upon a time, these players would produce kind of market research. So they would paint pictures of what the market is. So Gideon Gartner, when he launched his firm, he shifted to a model of decision support, right? And that's actually quite important for how they design their research. And so when they construct these markets, they do three things. They frame, so they give a name to a new area. They'll create a distinction, so they'll provide a ranking of all the players in the area. And they'll do this third thing, which is the drawing. They'll actually physically draw the market through these beautiful pictures. And so, as you can see, this is not really beautiful. It's too clouded. This is not beautiful because it's actually, there's not much going on here. It's not very interesting. So if you're a buyer and you look at this, there's not much to work out because nobody's moving and they're all in the same box. But this is a good picture because you can make sense of it pretty much straight away. So there's two aspects to being beautiful. You can make sense at a glance, okay, which relates to Paolo's point. Okay, I can look at it, I can see it, and I get the market straight away. The other aspect is it's beautiful because it means that the person will contact Gartner. Having looked at the picture, it's complex enough for them to still have questions. If they look at this, okay, there's no complexity in this market, so there's nothing for them to work out. This one also, there's lots of choices, so they'll contact Gartner as well. So it's beautiful for two reasons. So they have a distinctive business model, and there's two aspects to this model. They do these things for their client, okay? So they're not attempting to capture or represent all the players in the market. What they want to do is help their user make a decision. So when you talk to them, they say, we're here for the user, the client, they're our customer. And if the vendor doesn't like the way we segment markets, well, we don't care. We don't give a damn about vendors, okay? They don't like the way we segment. We're here for the user. And if we're not interesting for the user, they won't renew their subscription. And the second point is that they want these reports, these diagrams, these markets to keep them in the game. So everything they do is for them to be involved within the decision. So when someone's trying to buy IT, they want to be always in that decision. And that you can see that going through all of their research. When Gideon Gartner, setting up the firm, began to radically restructure from market research, which was kind of like academic-like, long reports, references, to one-pagers, quick diagrams you could make sense of. And the idea is that these reports are what he would describe as deliberately incomplete. Okay, so the idea is you look at them at a glance, but you want to know more, so you ring the analyst. Now, okay, so that's the background, but the key thing is well, how do they actually, when they come to a new area, there's an emerging market, how do they actually, and they call this size the market, how do they size the market? There's lots of change, there's lots of players coming into it, like social software, lots of stuff going on. How do they decide how big that market's going to be, right? How many segments, for example, do they decide? So we looked at CRM, Customer Relationship Management, which has been around for about 20 years now. And so when CRM came out, they decided it's going to be one big market, right? And we'll call it CRM. And they had one label, CRM, and one magic quadrant. And they listed all the players, 7 or 8 players on that quadrant. The problem was that none of their buyers actually bought CRM systems. They would want a smaller version of a CRM system, something like a marketing campaign solution. So they'd buy parts of a CRM system. They wouldn't buy one solution. So the user didn't find that single segment useful. So what they did was then to segment the market. And so they went from 1 to 16. So now they have 16 different names, 16 different magic quadrant. Each one, as the quote says, describing its own market. So from 1 to 16. But did it finish there? No, there's more to this story. So 16 isn't the totality. They discovered, or they found, in fact, there's something like 50 distinctions in the market. So there's 50 groupings they can identify of players doing different kinds of technologies. And here's a kind of list of it. But there's two things about that. One is they haven't got time to write up the 50 or so. Here it says 48. So actually doing the work of making these markets is actually substantial. It takes a lot of work to create a market. So they haven't got time. And so what they did was they picked the 16 they get most asked about. Right? The 16 that they would make public to their users, that their clients would find useful. These are the markets that they actually will pursue. So you have this distinction between kind of back office markets and front office. So back office is the 50, and the front office is the 16. And so one of the reasons why they decided to stay with 16 rather than go towards 50 is that the user finds them difficult. So even though the vendors, there are 50 distinct categories of technology out there, they decide they're only going to identify 16. And this is because otherwise it would be too complex for the user to make sense of what's going on. So the user won't know who to talk to, they won't know which consultant, they won't know which magic quadrant, they won't know which segment, and so on. And they could have to speak to a lot of different analysts before they get to the technology they want. Okay, so they do this for the client, they make it 16. So the 48, do they do anything? Well, the 48 are kind of like these back office segments, right? These are distinctions which exist, and they catalogue these, and they're things that they think will, in the future the client will be interested in. So what they do is they occasionally they sit down, as the quote says, they have a powwow, and they decide, can we upgrade some of these? So from the 48, they could be upgraded into these public markets. And the key for upgrading is when the 20 players emerge. So when you see this, the market's firmed up. So the market's firmed up when there's 20 players, because 20 players is the magic quadrant, is the beautiful picture. So that's another indicator of when a market's emerging, and it can be upgraded. There's 20 or so players, which gives the beautiful picture. But they also could be downgraded. So they may decide that they're going to, merge a couple of markets together, kill a couple, get rid of them as well. So they'll sit down in this powwow and decide to downgrade markets as well. Now these are, if you talk to these analysts, these are temporary mechanisms. They know this. For them, these are just things which are temporary. And they talk about the idea of a stalking horse, which is an internal term they have for something which goes out there for a while, does a bit of work, which may have to bring back in again to kill off, because it won't last that long. So they're meant to be temporary, and they will retire them, especially when things become uninteresting. So for example, on this quadrant, there's only 4 or 5 players, and that's not really interesting for the buyer, so they'll retire it. Sometimes it's difficult because these spaces belong to somebody, they belong to an analyst, so it's their turf as well, so this is their area, so they'll fight often with the analyst to actually retire something. So sometimes these temporary mechanisms may last up to 15 years. And often it's because they become entangled with the career of an analyst. And sometimes when these people retire themselves or leave, you'll see these markets being retired. So they're kind of wound up with the careers of these analysts. Now, all well and good, okay? So they do this stuff internally, but actually this stuff has a big impact upon the players in the market, okay? And in some respects, it's positive, but it's negative. It can be destructive. In the same way, any kind of classification, is an injustice to someone. And so this analyst here is talking about how when he came up with a new term, workforce optimization, he killed off a number of other markets with his new term. And I guess this is quite normal. So you invent a new term with a magic quadrant, and you could kill off a variety of markets in doing that. And so they're quite used to doing that. They know that they will kill off other markets through their new interventions. And of course, the vendors in those markets get very angry. Okay, so if your market's killed off, overnight, you get very, very angry. And they get angry for a number of reasons, right? I'm just flagging one here. So internally, if you're in a large IT vendor and your market gets killed off, it's a disaster. It means, for example, that you're no longer on the Magic Quadrant. If you're not on the Magic Quadrant, your kind of placing doesn't feed into the kind of scorecard used by the firm. You're not important to the manager of the area. He's no longer, or she's no longer reporting about you upwards to the top. And you're talked about as a kind of, as in a different language. You're now become a mature organization. You're like a cash cow rather than a growth market. So when this happens to you, when your market's killed off, it's a disaster. Sometimes it means that you can't enter markets. So you have global players who are, in all the markets. They find that the market becomes segmented. And here the informant's talking about how there was the creation of a North American market for one technology, and the firm who had been a player in that market could no longer enter that market because it was not on the Magic Quadrant. It was not recognized as a player in the market. So what it had to do was to partner with a North American player to re-enter the same area it's always been in. And so these prosthetic markets can often encourage partnerships, and these often lead to kind of mergers and acquisitions. So many of the mergers and acquisitions kind of occur around these kinds of Magic Quadrants. Now, these are temporary mechanisms, and sometimes they can be stopped. And so this is an example of someone who got really, really upset when Gartner had just coined a new market called SOA, Software Oriented Architecture. And it had been around for a year, and it was taking off. They defined it, there was a Magic Quadrant, etc. And almost immediately, they launched an SOA 2.0. So they created a new market, right? And people got really angry about it. And this guy, who's an analyst for another firm, he felt so passionate about it, he set up a petition to oppose it. And he got lots of signatures from people in the industry. They said it's not right, it's not helpful, it's destructive, etc., etc. It got into the press, the IT press, and they were able to stop it, to oppose it. And so no one no longer talks about SOA 2.0. It's been retired. Okay, so just some kind of discussion, some points. I mean, we've not really kind of developed discussion yet, so your feedback on this would be appreciated. So these markets, and they are, powerful interventions which are shaping activities, and you saw Facebook at work. So partially, Facebook at work's emergence is as a result of these prosthetic markets. And so these markets, they result from these the knowledge system put in place, the affordances. And people have begun to call for, an anthropology of intermediaries to look at not just the way in which they can constitute markets, but actually, the kind of the fine-grained nature of their kind of knowledge machinery. The machinery within these organizations themselves are quite instrumental in shaping. And these interventions, although they're meant to be temporary, can actually proceed in helping into being actual markets. And they may not be tightly related to what's going on, to the technical differences, but actually, they make those differences real. They have this very kind of distinctive life cycle. So I've tried to capture the life cycle here. So they're born, they're upgraded, they're downgraded, they're killed off, retired, etc. And they have a kind of specific temporal and spatial validity. So their lifespan is linked to this issue for how long they're useful to the client. That's their lifespan. As long as they're useful to the client, they'll exist. But once they go beyond that, they're killed off. And so these markets are very much, they're presenting a picture of the industry, but they're done for the consumer, right? For the Gartner client. That's who they're done for. And what Gartner are trying to do is to make the complex market beautiful for the consumer so they can consume it. And so their segmentation strategy is selective. And so they kind of there's a range for how much complexity or how much simplicity they should represent to their users. So it's 16 and not 1, 16 and not 48. Okay, in some sense what they're doing, they're pre-selecting for the user. And I have a point to make about what this means for commensuration. But just before I do that, I try to kind of, just to represent that. I'm not very good at diagrams, but So what you're seeing is this radical shift from market research. And this is, I mean, we could call this, we've talked quite a lot about economics this morning. So this is, let me carry that theme on. This is how economists would talk about the market. You're trying to represent what's out there, right? And that's the market research view of the world. Instead, these players are doing decision support, right? They don't care what the market, the whole range of the market. What they want to do is find out the range by which the user finds their research simple. So, and this 16 here is the beautiful picture when it's the spot where the user finds it useful. And this has implications for the idea of commensuration. This debate maybe it means something to some of you, but actually and not much to others. But commensuration is a kind of big deal in the study of markets, because the assumption is this is what these actors do, they commensurate. And so the article I've looked at, or the stuff I've been looking at, is from Lounsbury, and Lounsbury takes the idea of commensuration from the work of Wendy Espeland, and she talks about commensuration as being radically inclusive. The idea is to, you bring more and more actors into a space, you draw a boundary, and therefore you compare them. That's how it works. But actually, in some respects, these actors are doing the reverse, right? It's not radically inclusive. They want to bring all the actors in. They want to proportion, and proportion was a word you mentioned as well. So they're proportionate. It's actually, and there's another sense of commensuration. It has two senses. One is about being radically inclusive, and it has another sense which people don't really talk about, which is about being proportionate, about limiting the amount of complexity, which is what they're doing. They're proportionate and they're limiting complexity. This is my last slide. Now, there is an interesting kind of politics associated with prosthetic markets, which is very different from how people typically talk about this stuff in this area. So the idea is that an intermediary would kind of be in bed with the big vendors, because the big vendors help support them as intermediaries. They buy the research, they help sell their products, et cetera, et cetera. And so the idea is that if you're, that the intermediary would, if there was a category dominated by a few incumbents, a few large players, SAP, IBM, et cetera, then the intermediary wouldn't touch that segment, because that's where the incumbents are. They're too powerful to touch. But in this case, you find the reverse, right? So a powerful sector with a few categories would be the first category to be retired. It's exactly what is up for retiral with these the prosthetic market. So the kind of politics that are ongoing are very, very different around these markets. Okay, and I'm finished.